Good to go now, Brian.
Great. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're well. Welcome to our fourth session of the final Transform event, Transform the Circular Economy. My name is Brian Harney and I'll be emceeing the event today. And we're very fortunate to be joined by Garry Connolly and Mary Cronin. As you may know, the Transform series is an online seminar series exploring the growing impact of digital transformation on business and society. So the Transform events to date have explored things like the future of work through to smart cities and communities. And we're really pleased that today we'll be looking at the sixth area of focus, which is how the digital technologies are impacting the circular economy. And we're really fortunate to be joined for this discussion by Garry Connolly, who's president and founder of Host in Ireland, and Mary Cronin, founder of Upthink Innovation Agency. So Garry will be discussing data as one of the greatest tools we have to fight climate change. And Mary will be discussing technology and ICT in the circular economy. So really interesting sessions. I'm really looking forward to get going. Just to let you know, the way to ask questions, and we really encourage questions, is through the Q&A function. So the chat function is disabled on this, but if we use the Q&A function, and I'll collate those questions, and then we'll have the chance to put those questions to the speakers at the end of the session. So Mary will kick off, followed by Garry. And again, we thank them for their time. And without further delay, I'll hand you over to Mary for the introduction.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for the invite. I hope you can see my screen okay there. So I'm going to talk to you today about technology, ICT, and circular business model innovations, what it really means, and what it means for you. What are the technology opportunities and insights from this? So maybe we'll start first with what is the circular economy and why we need a circular economy. So
Mary,
approximately...
just sorry to interrupt it, just to check that you have your screen shared at the moment. I'm just...
Oh, I have my screen shared, yeah.
Yeah, there we go. That's better. Okay, thanks very much. Cheers.
Great. Okay, then. Okay. So we'll start with what is the circular economy and why we need a circular economy. So approximately 2 billion metric tons of municipal solid waste is produced annually, and that will grow double in the next 10 years. That's a lot of waste. But to put that in perspective, because we hear a lot about this, that's enough waste to fill over 13 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. And really, we have to think about how we're going to manage this waste going forward. So what I'm going to talk about over the next 20 minutes is the circular economy, circular business model innovation, navigating this ecosystem. And I'm going to also talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and the drivers from a technology, ICT, and innovation aspect. And also, I have a few case studies. And I do a lot of work here in Upthink around pathways from the linear to the circular economy, and I'll show you a quick methodology on that when we finish. So to start with, what is the linear economy? So there are only so many infinite resources that we have. So take, make, and waste, dispose what we currently have. We extract the resources from the ground, they're built into products, we distribute them, they're consumed and they're disposed of. And that is what we call the linear economy. Versus the key elements of a circular economy are that we design out waste, we keep products and materials in use, and that we regenerate the natural biological systems. So a circular economy is restorative by design. And this diagram that I have here is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. You may know the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in the UK. So the circular economy and the circular bioeconomy, and I work in both sectors. The bioeconomy is all about the renewable biological resources, which is how we take the bio resources from the land, the sea, and the crops, and how we create the renewable part of these. And the circular economy, the blue circle here, is around the opportunities and the challenges and risks related technically to the recovery and the material choices we make. So a key element of the circular economy is thinking about those materials before they go into the system and before you put them into your business model. So just some key differences between linear and circular. In linear, as I said, it's take, make, and dispose, whereas circular, it's around how we reduce, recycle, reuse, remanufacture. And a focus here is on efficiency versus how effective we are. So doing things the right way, which we have been doing for many years in linear, versus doing the right things in circularity. Now, circular economy and circularity is nothing new, actually. 50 years ago, we used to repair our washing machines and repair our fridges. System boundaries from a linear aspect are around our short term, really from purchase to sale, and that's it. And the dispose mentality versus circular, we're really thinking about when we build a product or design a business model, it's about the longer term, and we're always thinking about dematerialization and at the end of life when we're creating and starting designing. And linear is about downcycling, whereas circular is about upcycling, cascading our products, and recycling, for example, like our plastics and segregating plastics. So one of the areas that I look very closely at when I work with companies is what I call navigating the ecosystem. So we have here in the center a pretty linear business model, but outside of that, when I work with companies who might have a linear company, there's a lot of external forces. For example, environmental trends, market forces, competitors, and political forces. So I look at the context around circular business model innovation and what's changing and what are the drivers. So if you look at my business model here in the center, I specialize in circularity. And what that means is that when we're building any business model, we always start with what the materials we're using, thinking about that end of life at the very outset at the design stage. And why do we do that? Things are changing very rapidly. From an environmental trends aspect, as you know, consumer behaviors are changing, and the whole drivers around environmental and societal behaviors are changing. So what does that mean to our SMEs who we're working with in organizations? It means that they can no longer just produce the amount of single-use plastics that they're producing. People are asking where their materials are coming from an ethical aspect, and where the materials are being disposed of. So from a market forces aspect, there's new markets, there's new types of investors. So when we look at the whole investor aspect, I work a lot from a funding and a finance aspect. And 10 years ago, investors wouldn't have thought too much about the whole ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance an aspect, but now they're really looking at fossil versus green. A lot of new funds have been developed in the whole green space, and investors are really coming away from fossil-based and going into green. The whole piece around local versus global. So we know now from a post-COVID and our supply chain that really looking at bringing our tomatoes, for example, from New Zealand or Spain isn't such a good idea, and how we can grow those locally. And like Nordic countries, building regional clusters. A lot of work has been done in the bioeconomy sector in Ireland around building regional clusters, and indeed in Kerry there's a southwest new regional cluster set up, and there's many developing. But we've really got to be advocates for these clusters and really look at building these locally, creating jobs, and these regional hubs, very successful in the likes of Germany and Denmark. In industry forces, we're looking at our primary producers and our entrepreneurs who are really investing heavily in some of these new areas, but also the technology piece and ICT. It's really our agri and our food sector is really data driven, and it's really tech driven. I come from a technology background, and I always look at the aggregation between what we're doing from a food and agri aspect and what are the technology drivers and the data drivers and the analysis behind this. Also the political forces we need when we're looking at our circular business model, because government's being heavily penalized now because of our targets, and so it's no longer we can pay our way out of this. We really need to be really focused on these targets and how we're going to reduce these, and indeed new legislation. So for example, circular economy legislation is coming down the road in about 18 months time, and we recently ran a webinar series just talking to our SMEs around the impact that new legislation will have for them. Some linear companies will be able to convert to circularity and will be able to look at those new business models, but unfortunately others won't, perhaps some in the manufacturing area. So I've aligned this with the Sustainable Development Goals, just to give you an idea of what they mean from a tech and an ICT aspect. And a key driver driving this is our world population. As you know, in 2030, 8.6 billion is what our population is estimated at, and 2050, 9.8 billion with the current resources we have. That puts a lot of pressure on those resources. And I've specifically marked here from a technology, ICT and data aspect, what SDGs we're targeting for. And here we've 7, 8 and 9. And they're ones I look at from a renewable energy aspect, but also from a tech and innovation aspect. So the role of ICT is critical, and it's critical from an innovation aspect in accelerating where we're going in these. So SDG 7 is around our renewables and our clean energy, and indeed in the Midlands we have a new regional hub focusing in on that whole renewables and clean energy. SDG 8 is an interesting one around decent work and economic growth. And this whole piece around digital innovation frameworks assisting countries and smart cities. So it's no longer about you do a project on circular innovation, it's about portfolios, it's about changing cities, it's about creating digital hubs, it's about even, for example, the likes of in Kerry, we have that cluster that I refer to, but also the Dingle Regional Hub. It's about taking that hub and working with that whole hub as a unit. And this is digital innovation and transformation. And this stimulates this piece around the ICT-centric innovation entrepreneurship. Now, Garry will be talking afterwards in around the data aspect of this. And this is a piece where I talk about portfolios and capability building our portfolios, but also we do portfolio investment. And there's a lot of money in Europe and around the Green Deal to manage these portfolios. It's deploying some of this money has been a challenge for us here in Ireland, but we're finding ways to do that. SDG 9 is around industry innovation and infrastructure, how we're going to drive change, and 17 is the partnership piece. It's more and more important that we break down the silos and that we work together as partners. So I work a lot with Department of Agri, Department of Energy, as well as academia, research, and industry and funding to be able to fund this. So a little bit about circular business model innovation. So this has been around for a while, but the key elements in any business model innovation is about understanding the unmet needs for your customers. So I do all outcomes driven design, and I always start with the pain points of my customer and the unmet need, and we validate that through UX and design, circular design. So we look at the circular inputs, what are the materials we're dealing with? We look at the supply chain and the circular supplies, and then we look at the resource recovery. How can we recover these resources to the end of life? I've given some examples here. IKEA have been doing this for a long time and claimed that by 2025, they'll be fully circular. Apple and iPhone later, I'll hopefully show you one moment on the iPhone. Resell, repair, reuse, Google on their servers. Product life extension, this is really important in how we do this. Fast fashion, H&M are taking back our clothes. Sharing platform, I don't know about you, I don't want to buy a car anymore. I don't want to buy a washing machine. I do not want to buy my fridge. I want the manufacturer to take responsibility for these and fix these products as we go along and not dispose them into landfill. As you know, we only have one incineration facility in this country and 3 landfills, and they are nearly full. Product as a service is Philips, and I'll touch on that later. We talk about breakthrough business model innovation, and that's an aggregation of what we've been doing for years. I've worked in Lean, We take our technology, we apply our lean principles, but circular business model innovation is all about three things. It's about how we develop our economic growth, the environment, how we're managing that, and the social impact. And it's data-driven, it's tech-driven for it to be scalable. When we look at the benefits from circularity aspect, we're looking at raw materials conservation, what that means, looking at the materials that are going in. If it's a bioproduct food waste, we're looking at how we anaerobically digest these. We're looking at the water consumption, and in fact using processes and technology where there's no water and no chemicals being used. We're looking at innovation in around engines, wind turbine and electric motors. We're looking at creating these jobs from a rural aspect and from building regional hubs. So we want to take some of this out of the urban areas and really build regional hubs. We're looking at all of the CO2 emissions to bring down our 2030, 2050 levels to zero. That includes waste, energy, and our raw materials usage. So what does this really mean? So I work with a number of frameworks, and the frameworks, this is one called Resolve. So in this, when we're looking to regenerate, we want to shift to renewables, energy into materials. We want to reclaim and we want to recover what I was talking about from a bioeconomy aspect, the biological resources. And that's very key. Land, use seaweed for our nutraceuticals, and ocean, land, and air. From a sharing aspect, we're creating the sharing economy, and for example, the likes of Airbnb, that's an example. We want to prolong life through maintenance, and we're designing for durability. Also the closed loop, we're remanufacturing products and components, the likes of Dell, Google and Apple are doing this. We want to digest anaerobically. So for example, taking in our food waste from our restaurants and the likes of Tesco, Green Generation, for example, have an anaerobic digester to take in all Tesco's waste, and they create plastic. And then we want to exchange, replace old with advanced and new. So it's really this whole cyclical piece. A lot of opportunities in Ireland. 100 million tonnes of materials used annually. This is from the EPA. 5% of materials improvement could yield 2.32 billion. Now that's plus for the Irish economy. And there's a great opportunity that's uncapitalized here for all of us, both from a government aspect and from an SME aspect. And if you're out there from a student aspect as well and looking for new roles, this is a great area. And I've just picked out a few case studies here. Google, I'm not going to go through all of this. They're just technology ones. 22% of their machine upgrades components refurbished. 36% of their servers are remanufactured, and over 2.1 million units were resold. So taking the products back in and they're remanufactured. Now the key part here for the largest organizations are 80% of landfill diversion, and that's where we've got to get to. We've got to divert what's going into landfill. Gary's going to talk about this, but we have zero waste data centers, and I thought I'd give this example. They partner with, Google partners with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and again, 18% of new servers are remanufactured. 2.1 million units unwanted equipment are used, so they're taking back and they're reusing. And from an office space aspect, they're diverting 78% of their waste from landfill at offices globally, and that's really important. So they're aiming to build 100% of consumer electronics by 2022, including recycled materials, and that's where we want to go to. I want to show you a short video here if I can for one moment. Great, okay. So what that means, Daisy, from an Apple aspect is when we talk about dematerialization, we want to recover, they are recovering 1,500 kilograms of aluminium, copper, cobalt, steel, in the phones that you have in your drawers, in your old laptops. There's very valuable resources that we need back. Over 74,000 metric tons of waste generated in Abbey 2018. That's 24% was diverted from landfill. Likewise, Philips Innovation Light as a service. So rather than you buying your lights, they're providing them as a service so that they will take care as a manufacturer of all your lighting. Circular lighting, it's called. And finally, just before I finish up, we need to move companies from linear to circular, and we have a process around that. And the process is basically, you know, we have a strategic development. Innovation is really looking at developing the full life cycle around circularity, and really starting at the design stage, designing for material reuse and the end of life. It's too late when you get to the end of life. We've got to think upstream. Here's just a methodology that we've created here at Upthink that we use to actually look at everything that we've talked about there, closing the loop, circular business model design, and all the external aspects. Okay, thank you. So now I would like to hand you over to Garry Connolly, who is the founder of Host in Ireland. Gary's going to talk about data, one of our greatest tools to fight climate change. Garry.
Sorry, Garry, it's the famous on mute comment.
Garry, you're just on mute.
Now, there you go. That's better. So thank you so much, Mary. Can you see that now? Is that okay? Yeah.
You can, yeah.
So thank you so much, Mary. Daisy the robot. What a great way to lead into my presentation, because ultimately people are getting such afraid of algorithms and robots and the likes that calling it Daisy somehow makes it more tangible. So thank you. I have 15 or so minutes to talk to you a little bit more about what's exactly going on with this data, with centers, how they fit into our modern economy, and globally where are we moving towards. So it might be an idea just to go back. Where are we with regard to our evolution, or revolutions as they call it, in industry, in commerce, in agriculture, in all aspects of our lives? Or we're in the fourth industrial revolution, just in case you've forgotten that we'd had three before. And steam was the aggregator, and it was the thing that created the first industrial revolution. It drove the pistons, it drove the pumps, it drove the steam engines, and made the world very small. And if we skip the middle two and we get to the fourth one, which is today, data is that steam. Data is what is driving innovation. Data is what's creating the opportunities, and data ultimately is the most valuable asset, along with human intellect and human integrity, that we have. So ultimately we're in the fourth industrial revolution, and the steam of today is the data. But like all things, there's a yin and a yang to everything that we face when it is worth challenging for. And when we look at data, it can be a weapon of mass distraction, as highlighted in this video, where it has given us, when we consider 4,000 to 5,000 more times the power that put man on the moon is in your smartphone. So when you consider everybody, or there's billions of devices walking around, we have a mass weapon of mass distraction. There's no question about it. Of all ages, we're all responsible for it. But then we also have to look at the other side of it. This same infrastructure, this same data is also giving us weapons of mass invention, whether it's this holographic cross-sectional brain dissection from a guy in Japan for somebody in Dublin. The same infrastructure is being used for both the positive and the less positive. But it's the same data, it's the same infrastructure, but it's all part of this overall ecosystem, which is effectively the industrial, or 4.0 is probably a better way to call it. You can deny it, you can embrace it, you can either say it doesn't apply to me, but it's happening. It is happening all around us. You may or may not be aware that algorithms are being used in Spotify, are being used in Google Maps. Algorithms we get frightened of when people mention algorithms and robots and stuff, but they're probably intrinsically ingrained already in a lot of what we're doing. So what we want to be mindful of is that it's everywhere. It's in every single aspect. Data is everywhere in all aspects of our lives, whether it's retail, whether it's hospitality, whether it's online shopping, whether it's schooling. Data is what makes that possible. And obviously, since we've been in a state of lockdown for the past year, it's just accelerated. The amount of devices that are being connected to what we would have called back in the day the superhighway of the internet is happening at such a multiple scale that we passed the one device for every person on the planet in 2010. And we are heading towards 50 billion devices by the end of 2022. And when one considers that there's only 5 of the 7 billion with connectivity, it makes it even more vast, the amount of devices that are connected to the internet, and every single one of them is creating data. COVID came along. What did it do? Well, actually, it's just accelerated in many respects most of the trajectory lines that we were already starting in. Some industries that were less digitized have accelerated to catch up. Those that were already digitized have effectively kicked on. It has effectively, quite literally, taken the amount of data and devices off the chart. And we are now starting to see projects and services that we thought will be in 2024 being accelerated into 2021, 2022. When you talk to Microsoft, Airbnb, Uber, or any of these other data-centric organizations, depending on who you're talking to, it can be anywhere between 2 and 4 years of acceleration in 6 months. And mainly that's to do with people, the human aspect of making a decision to embrace digitization or to block it. There has been no reason to block digitization in the past 9 to 12 months. Ultimately, if you blocked it, unfortunately, the business would fail. The only way to trade in many industries has been by being online, using data, and ultimately the infrastructure that supports it. We talk about data as if it's something people understand. We talk about data in megawatts, in zettabytes and petabytes and all these other things. People don't really understand that. I don't understand that. But we do understand rice. So to give you a sense of how much data is and will be created, let's equate it to 1 grain of rice. If a grain of rice was 1 byte, 1 zettabyte, which is, we're in the zettabyte era right now, would fill the Pacific Ocean. Take all the land masses of the earth, fill it into the Pacific Ocean, you still have wiggle room. You may remember a couple of years ago, we lost a plane in this particular ocean. And that is only 1 zettabyte of data, if it was rice. 165 zettabytes of data will be created every year on an incremental basis from the year 2025. We're probably currently in about a 40 to 45 zettabyte space, but this is the data that has been created by all those industries that we've just discussed, which ultimately need the center to keep that data dry, safe, secure, protected. So what I thought I'd do, just to give you a context, so that gives us a context to the data sphere, as it were. But when we talk about data centers, there's 2 words in data centers: data and the center. So let's look at then these 2 words in the context of why we need data centers. And let's, for the start, actually look at the center. That's the building. For a lot of people, There's two sides to this magical cloud. It's the device that they have in their hand. That's the physicalization of the internet, and this thing called a data center. They're the physical aspects of what's called the cloud. If we look at over the last 10 years, and it's great to be able to call it the last 10 years, and we look at the amount of data, which we've discussed, the amount of compute power, it's around about 9 to 12 times more data is traversing the internet now than was 10 years ago. We have up to 12 times more compute power. This is the power that's needed to do the algorithms that we're asking it to do. And yet, when we look at the use of electricity, which is the input stuff for a center, it's flat globally, about 1%, because we've always had data centers, but they were just inefficient data centers. And as you can see here, that is highlighted on the left-hand side with the International Energy Association saying, well, we've just changed where that energy or that electricity is being consumed, because we're moving from inefficient on-premise, it's called, where you have a server in the corner or you have a wiring closet with servers. It's probably not that efficient. It's probably in a building that's badly air conditioned. They're all being decommissioned and being centralized. So as we see these data centers, these very large centralized centers, we're seeing a decommissioning of so many others that are more sporadic and around the place and less efficient. So ultimately now we're in the era where we can start to see, okay, well, if we centralize all that, surely we then can get efficiencies. Absolutely. When we get efficiencies, then we can sign up one power purchase agreement. Yeah. And who are these people that are hosting Airbnb and Uber and Revolut and Google Class and all these other brand names for data that sits inside of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook? They're the ones that are buying the largest power purchase agreements on renewable energy. So what we're doing is we're effectively consolidating all this stuff into a central location, putting one contract on it for renewable energy, rather than having thousands upon hundreds of thousands of smaller centers all over the planet, which could or may not have coal or gas or etc. So this is the whole concept behind the migration. Then you've got the big platforms. As I said earlier, a lot of people say, oh, Facebook or Google or Microsoft. Well, actually, they're just like Dundrum Shopping Centre. They're the big brand that within them, they then have Airbnb, Google, Nest, etc. So we must be mindful that the centers themselves of Amazon and Google are the ones that hold a lot of the more commonly used brands. And they're now moving to be number one purchasers of renewable energy, because not everywhere is migrating at the same level. We're moving from a very fossilized based electrical system globally to a more renewable, sustainable, and we're trying to do it in 20 years. These dudes better write checks. These dudes better put the commitment down to get more renewable onto the grid so that all of us, including our homes, can benefit. So that's the centers. But what's the data doing then? Because we know that 1% is still 1% too much. But let's look at the data and the data that's in the centers. What's it doing for the economy? What's it doing for the decarbonization? So when you talk about, Mary had some great examples of what's classified as the dematerialization of the planet. Well, the dematerialization of the planet in my world isn't necessarily taking nickel and iron out of stuff that's already made. It's actually stopping the stuff being made at all. Because like a lot of things, if you want it, the greatest and the most renewable electricity is electricity not used. That's the greenest. So when you look at this is my desk, or many of you that are maybe watching's desk from only 15 years ago. And effectively it's disappeared. You know, all these things that we now call apps on our phone are now one of those things that's just disappeared, from a Filodex to a computer even. So this is the dematerialization of the world that's happening in my world, that's been replaced by data, and that data then is sitting in centers. So just for a moment, think about all of the carbon emissions from the creation, the distribution, and the usage that has been taken out of the world because of this data that sits in these centers. We can also then, which is a wonderful book, if you haven't read it, you should probably have a look at it, How Bad Are Bananas? where this dude, Mike Berners-Lee, who happens to be the brother of the guy who invented the internet, has looked at the world and he's looked at all aspects of our life and he's tried to put a carbon, like a calorie counter on everything we do. And what he's done is very, very appropriate for this platform, which we're on, the Zoom. He's equated 2 grams of CO2 per hour. 25 grams, is it? 25 grams of CO2 per hour on average is created by a Zoom call. Okay? So without context, that sounds a lot or little or nothing, right? So what I did was I had a look at this book and I basically had a ready reckoner on it. And when you look at a return flight to Hong Kong, it's about 3.5 tons of CO2. Look at the amount of time, amount of kilograms or time will be spent online with Zoom equivalent. Likewise, then that's thing of the past, or maybe the thing of the future is flying again. Let's look at a bottle of wine. Let's look at a cup of tea. Let's look at a banana. So effectively, a banana has the same inherent carbon, 4.4 hours of Zoom. So when we're balancing up about different aspects of society, when we're looking at, well, do we really need to travel 15 people to Tokyo or Hong Kong for a meeting when we can do it over Zoom? Guess what? When you take the balance between the data and the centers, we're starting to get a picture that the data in society is reducing a huge amount of carbon that isn't allocated against the physical usage in the center. This is a really great one. I really like this one I picked up. This was somewhere in Britain where they were looking as a society by 2022 to reduce over 47.45 gigawatt hours of traditional carbon-based activities. They said we need to get this out, like what Mary was saying. We need to eradicate completely the carbon inherent in our living, in society's living. So they got this very complex, look at this, very complex network of connected things with MIBs and probes, and they were going to do campuses, they were going to do energy and the grid and mobility and transport and the whole thing. And it was all going to revolve around this thing called MindSphere from a company called Schneider or Siemens or somebody. But actually, what's MindSphere? It's a data center. It's a data center. It's a center that holds data, that the data is then going out into society, and it's it that is reducing the carbon. It's it that's doing the algorithms. It's it that's giving the insights and the intelligence to reduce. So the brand that you see is actually just resident in a data, which is in a data center, often forgotten. Most people, when I talk to people, they don't see what the data does for society. They just look at the center. Like looking at a cornfield. If you were to look at a cornfield and see the corn blowing in the wind, you think that's useless. But you forget that it's made for bread to feed people. So we need to constantly be looking at why. Why do we need data? We talked about that. Why do we need centers? We talked about that. Now, what else is it doing? Well, the data is the actual magic. Here's another example of a very common product now, 8 years in the marketplace. It's called the Nest, the Google Nest or whatever. It's a thermostat that sits in your house and it learns about your heat, what you need, what you don't need, when you go out, when you don't go out. And when you look at that and aggregate, that really is data driven. It's an algorithm in a center. The numbers are quite astounding as to what amount of carbon it's taken. 50 billion kilowatt hours of energy have been saved by the data in a center driving the Nest. And that can be multiplied and aggregated up. The data is what the centers are just there to help keep the rain off. The value of the data is everything that Mary has spoken about. Because we much measure things, we manage them, we learn from them, we don't repeat. And ultimately, the greatest advocate for climate change, behavioral change, is David Attenborough. Nobody can question that. And a couple of months ago, David Attenborough came out and said, Attenborough joins Instagram in a bid to save the planet. Attenborough joins a data center in a bid to save the planet. Because remember, these Instagram are just names of products that are data in centers. So to get through this, to get to the next level, all of us, society, data, we need to get context. We need to drill down a bit, and we need to be brave, creative, and constantly relentless, seeking out context to make sure that we don't make decisions that are going to actually reduce the amount of renewable fed centers that are needed as the oxygen in our economies to reduce energy. So thank you for that. That's my piece done. I hope I've given you a sense of what the data is, what the centers do, how the data is being used in a lot of places, because a lot of people think data is just cats running up curtains in Facebook. It's way more than that. So thank you so much for your time. I'll hand you back to Mary, and I think we're going to do some Q&A, Brian, are we?
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much both, just for reframing our thinking, and passionate pleas from the two of you in terms of your case. There's a few questions coming in. I just have one that I was thinking of as both of you were talking, and that was, what do you think the key challenges are, or what are you confronting when you're trying to get traction for these ideas? So what are the stumbling blocks in terms of getting this message out, your respective messages?
Yes, maybe I might just take that first, maybe with the circular economy and the bioeconomy. I guess some key messages are in around even local versus global. There's a lot of opportunities in Ireland, a lot of opportunities for SMEs. When earlier stage companies are building their business models, really they have to think about circularity and building in that dematerialization, but also changes need to happen at that ecosystem level and policy level. So policy is an inhibitor in some cases, in some sectors now. So from a government aspect, working when building some larger, say for example in the bioeconomy, scaling organizations, you really have to look at does the policy cover you? And the last piece is in around financing. There's a lot of finance for a lot of these projects in Europe, but deploying the finance in Ireland has been somewhat of a problem, but the finance is there.
Yeah, finance and technology won't be the inhibitors for the planet decarbonizing between now and 2050. But what could possibly be the inhibitor? Humans, our inability to embrace the full extent of what can be done, misinformation, lack of context, you know, all those things. But technology has never been the inhibitor. So many things, decisions, procrastination, trying to protect old worlds. These are the greatest challenges in life, you know. And when you look at the oil and gas industry, they have a huge role to play, more than we like to think, in the decarbonization of the world. But certain sectors of that don't want it to change at all. You know, policies, it's tough, isn't it? It's tough being a policymaker at a time when there's so much change, so much adversity, so much uncertainty around the world, because they mostly are led by populations and their view on things. And what we've done as part of the world in the last 20 years is we've effectively put in the hands of everybody a mouthpiece where they can be as effective as the editor of the Wall Street Journal. And some of them are, of course, unqualified in many respects, not in a position where there's any checks or measures. So therefore, misinformation, lack of context, people are busy, they're not drilling down. That's a big inhibitor. The burning of 5G antenna. You know, when we talk about sort of helping people in Cork and places where a hospital gets knocked out because somebody just firebombed a 5G antenna. You know, these types of things are really, really destructive. Let's learn. Let's, you know, I say often, ignorance now is an option. It wasn't always. You were either lucky enough or you were unlucky enough to have the Encyclopedia Britannica at home. And that gave you an advantage. Gave me an advantage. I had it at home. But now you've the internet. Now you can err towards that area, or you can err towards actually understanding what the challenges are. But I liked what Mary was saying earlier. It's a lot of it's about behavior, a lot of it's about mindset, a lot of it's about being ready for change, embracing change. There's only three things that are going to happen to us in life: pay taxes, die, and change. And we're going to see so much change in the next 10 years that we're going to laugh at ourselves when we see what we're going to be doing in 2030. Money and technology will not be the inhibitors for a decarbonized society. That's what I do know. What the other bits I don't know.
And that's great, and it links very much into the one of the questions that came up, which is, I suppose, is that tension between the voluntary action versus the regulatory action, and the question was specifically around sort of ISO environmental standards, and to what extent do they have upcycling and the sustainability goals embedded into them. And I suppose it's a general question that is how much does regulation play a part, and does standards and embedding upcycling and sustainability into new standards form part of the movement, I suppose.
Mary, you'd have to take that.
Sorry, Mary, just on mute. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
So I responded to that question live. So regulators for sure, and governments are using those ISO standards as a base to create policy and further develop those goals. So yes, it's happening, but it's happening slowly as well, which is, it's unfortunate policy takes time to happen. But one of the key drivers of this will be investment, and will be investment for new companies. So regulation policy is happening. ISO standards are definitely changing. Targets are there. Targets are being set. Whether they're being met or not is something different. But a driver will be investments. A lot of money is coming out from, and even we see in pensions and green bonds, a lot of money is coming out from fossil fuel and going into green biorefineries, green companies, green organizations. So that in itself will drive change. And the other piece, our accounting system, it's maybe on the peripherals of what we're talking about. Our accounting system is very dated, as in our natural accounting system takes into account profit and loss from an economic aspect. But with ESG going forward, investors and companies will be accountable for not just economic growth, and this is not doing good on CSR. They'll be accountable for environmental impacts on the bottom line. And this will be built into our accounting system, and the social impacts on the bottom line. So companies, shareholders will demand change from them, and that's where the change will come from. I suppose it's hard to think that our accounting system would change perhaps to that degree, but those kind of changes are coming for sure.
And follow the money, Mary. You know that. Follow the money, because ultimately great ideas need two things to really flourish. Well, three things: look, great people, and timing. But you also need money. And when you look at the likes of BlackRock, and you look at these big
Goldman Sachs, yeah,
Goldman Sachs, 7 trillion market, who are adding a seventh pillar for their assessment of how and who they're going to invest in, then you start to see, okay, why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that because they're investing other people's money and they don't want it to vaporize. So you can get very black and white about it, but that's what BlackRock do, right? Then you look at the insurance companies, where now what they're looking at is, if you don't factor into your business the effects of climate change, the effects of it, you're not going to get insurance. So if you're not actually in a hotel chain that is 100% moving towards, well, we're not going to insure you. So that puts you stops in your tracks. If you're not going to actually embrace the SG criterias and stuff, they will not insure you, they won't reinsure you, and the system stops. So this is what's different. This is what's very different from, say, before, is that the money, those awful people in stock markets, these awful people that have made so much money and will continue to make money, have shifted their mindset to say the best return on investment over the next decade is in the green economy. So guess what? Rightly or wrongly, time will tell. But what if we make better air? And what if we make better water? And what if we make all this and we're wrong? It's still a better world, right?
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah,
key.
and I guess just to add to that, what Gary's saying, if we look at North America, what's happening in Canada, a lot of investment has been taking place in the last 10 years in food companies, agri companies, water, waste. And we haven't been investing in that in Europe. You know, we're investing in, you know, the tech, and a lot of, even from a smaller private investments are happening in, you know, not longer scales of return, but smaller investment amounts. But whereas in Europe, what will happen is investors are moving into those. They haven't currently been in them, because if you're building a hexafly or you're building a, you know, a large biorefinery, they're longer term projects. They're higher capital upfront cost. They take longer to build. So investors think, you know what, it's easier to invest in tech. Whereas more investors are heading in this direction because they see it almost as a no-brainer, and that it will give a better return of investment. So that's also driving that change of mindset. And even now, you know, there's a lot of money and a lot of private investment out there. And they're looking for new places to invest in. And this is an area where the bioeconomy and the circular economy, waste, resource recovery, that they're saying, how do we understand more about this? And in fairness to government, the Irish government doing a lot around the Irish bioeconomy and the circular economy with the likes of Circular. So.
Great, thanks. I think you're right in terms of the signaling that if the money is going there, that's for better or for worse, that's a messaging in terms of a shifting mindset, and with the accounting standards. And you also get countries like New Zealand moving away from GDP and focusing on specific objectives, some of which are related to sustainability and also diversity and inclusion, rather than the hard economic measures of the past. I don't see any questions coming in. So one thing that I was also thinking, and it might be useful to people, where do we see exemplars in terms of companies, countries, or maybe people? If we were to look and try and see where the ideal is, or who's doing really well on this, what are your call outs maybe?
On what? I mean, there's an awful lot going on food, on transport, on home heating. You know, there's so much going on right now. That one of the things, even going back to the last question, is human behavior has such a large role to play. I live in a home in Enniskerry, as you can see here, with two young daughters. We've got 3 bins. We have the choice in what we put into the 3 bins. And that, I can tell you, that is going to drive an awful lot of what we're doing as well, is that there's no point in policies changing. There's no point in advocacy. There's no point in that. If just people won't do what's needed for the 3 bins, maybe this is the last time you'll get a diesel or a petrol car. Maybe you don't need it either. Yeah. Maybe this is the last time you'll get a gas burner in your house. You know, get a heat pump. You know, maybe before we object to change in our renewable energy sources like offshore wind or onshore wind or solar, we think a little bit more and say, okay, but I have to think about my grandchildren or great grandchildren. You know, so people, our decisions will influence so much at a local level. And there are exemplars all over the place. In Ireland, even, for communities that are fabulous, who are the world's largest pollinator per square acre. the world's, little exemplars. But I think we have to be mindful also that if it bleeds, it leads. We're human beings that navigate towards sensational negativity. We don't amplify those small pockets because it doesn't make the front of the newspaper. Boy saves 3 boys on Bray Head. Boy falls off cliff in Bray Head. So it's just the nature of seek out these stories. Mary mentioned many of them. Like there's a thing going on in Burr, is it, Mary? Got a call recently. It's amazing what they're doing. There's exemplars everywhere if we decide to look. Policy's a tough one, right? Always a tough one, no matter what country, because the lads and the girls have to look at 3 years hence, re-election. But that's where our behavior doesn't have to be connected with political bias. Our behavior can be just based on what is the right thing to do consistently. The brown, the green, and the whatever other color the building is. You don't need to be told by government to do that. We should be. My kids are telling me to do it. That's a good thing, by the way.
Yeah, that's a really, and just to, I suppose, finish off on that point, that's a really important point, Gary, that one on consumer behavior and what we're doing in our own mindset, how we're changing. And circular economy is nothing new. We grew up with, we didn't dispose of everything and throw everything out. Oh, now we know our landfills are full. But if you look at the Nordic countries and education and how kids are trained, and in Sweden, they've built regional hubs. They have anaerobic digesters in Germany on their farms to take in the waste and reuse the waste and transfer it into power and grid and byproducts. So it is around how we're doing and how the policymakers aren't going to tell us how to do that. But it starts, I guess, with education, and it starts with us understanding what the consequences are and what we want to leave behind for others as well.
My kids even told me recently, Brian, that when my shirts wear out, they're putting patches on my elbows like the good old days because they don't want me to have to go and buy another one. So arm patches are in, right? This is my fashion statement for today.
The proper academic arm patches of old, yeah.
Proper academic arm patches. But that's another example, isn't it? It's that whole, as Mary said, going back to when you only had one good shirt, you only had one good jacket.
Yeah, look, I'm conscious of the time there, and I think you've certainly put across many ideas, and the idea of the mindset was one message I'm coming across, that we just think about our thinking and make judgments about our judgments, if you like. And I suppose I just want to thank you both for really, as I said, passionate presentations. I really, really enjoyed listening to them, and I know the people watching will have as well. So thank you both very much for your time, Mary and Garry, and it's very much appreciated. That's actually the end of the Transform events. So just a reminder that they are available on the Business Schools, DCU Business Schools YouTube channel. And just to thank everyone that has been engaged over the last 6 months. And personally, I have nothing to do with the design of these or the management, but I have to give credit to my colleagues in DCU Business School and the Irish Institute for Digital Business that have done, because I think it is a phenomenal resource for people. And when we're talking about changing thinking and getting people communicated, this is a great vehicle in and of itself. So I think credit to my colleagues for that. And finally, just to touch on something that Mary mentioned, for those interested in sustainable business development goals for business, the school are also running a number of talks on those until the 7th of April, covering things like Goal 14, Life Below Water, Goal 15, Life on Land, Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions, and also the final one, Partnership for the Goals. So there's an ongoing series for people to look into as well. But on that note, I'll just thank you all for attending. Thank you for your engagement, and thank you again to Mary and Garry for their thought-provoking presentations. Cheers.
Great. Thank you, Garry. Thank you, Brian.